Welcome to a journey into the shadowy corners of 1950s cinema, where bold filmmakers dared to show violence and vice on the big screen. From surreal psychological horrors to raw juvenile delinquency dramas, these 20 films crossed the line of what censors would allow. Each of these titles was banned for its brutal imagery, unflinching realism, or taboo themes, pushing the very limits of mid-century morality. Stick around as we uncover the stories behind the screen and explore why authorities tried to erase these films from history. Dementia. Dementia is a daring, dialogue-free horror experiment by writer-director John Parker that plunges viewers into a young woman's fragmented psyche. The film, shot in stark black and white, follows Adrienne Barrett's character, the Gammon, as she awakens alone in a dilapidated hotel and wanders into the rain-slicked streets of Los Angeles' Skid Row. Along the way, she encounters grotesque caricatures, a dwarf hawking mysterious stabbing newspapers, a leering pimp, a brutish drunk, and a wealthy patron whose fascination turns deadly, all rendered in expressionistic shadows and jolting cuts that blend horror, film noir, and surrealism. Parker conceived Dementia from a dream his secretary recounted, expanding it into a 58-minute feature with no spoken words, only an ominous score by George Antheil and jazz riffs from Shorty Rogers. Its unapologetic depiction of violence, stabbings, beatings, and the Gammon's own act of revenge against her abusive past pushed 1950s audiences past their limits. When he first submitted it in 1953, the New York State Film Board banned Dementia outright, labeling it inhuman, indecent, and the quintessence of gruesomeness, forcing Parker to shelve the film until a heavily cut re-release in December 1955. Its reputation only grew after Exploitation. King Jack H. Harris re-edited it with Ed McMahon narration and retitled it Daughter of Horror in 1957. Though it finally reached British screens in 1970, the BBFC's refusal to certify it for 13 years solidified Dementia's status as one of the decade's most brutal and boundary-shattering films. Baby Doll. Baby Doll is a southern-tinged black comedy by Elia Kazan, adapted by Tennessee Williams from two of his one-act plays. Set in the cotton fields of rural Mississippi, the story centers on Archie Lee Mahan, a middle-aged gin owner who has lived apart from his naive 19-year-old bride, Baby Doll, until the day she turns 20, when, by a family bargain, the marriage may finally be consummated. Kazan's camera lingers on Baker's perpetual child-in-a-crib persona, while Eli Wallach's Sicilian rival, Silva Vaccaro, injects a predatory sexuality that undercuts every frame with tension. Upon its December 1956 debut, Baby Doll ignited moral outrage for its erotic symbolism, the iconic crib, the suggestive swinging chair seduction, and whispers of what lay beneath Baker's dress. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned it as grievously offensive to Christian and traditional standards of morality and decency, triggering withdrawals from dozens of theaters. Time magazine blasted it as just possibly the dirtiest American-made motion picture ever legally exhibited, and several countries banned the film outright for its exaggerated sexual content. Despite, or because of, this backlash, Baby Doll became shorthand for 1950s sexploitation, winning Golden Globe recognition even as it courted censorship battles across the globe. She Shoulda Said No, She Shoulda Said No is a hard-hitting drug exploitation film directed by Sam Newfield and starring Lila Leeds. Inspired by Leeds' own 1948 marijuana arrest alongside Robert Mitchum, the movie frames its story as a cautionary exposé of narcotics. A chorus girl's experimentation with weed spirals into addiction, her family's shame, and her brother's suicide. Shot on a shoestring, it trafficked in sensationalism, crude depictions of drug dens, moralistic narration, and lurid intertitles, all under the guise of education. In August 1953, Pennsylvania's State Board of Censors deemed She Shoulda Said No immoral, indecent, not proper, and tends to both corrupt and debase moral, enforcing a statewide ban that lasted years. Other states followed suit, afraid the film's lurid images would glamorize drug use rather than warn against it. Though Newfield later re-edited it for limited re-release, The stigma of illicit substance exploitation kept this one-of-a-kind cautionary tale out of wide circulation throughout much of the 1950s. The Wild One. The Wild One, directed by Laszlo Benedek and starring Marlon Brando in an iconic leather jacket, is often cited as the original outlaw biker film. Brando's Johnny Strabler and his Hells Angels-inspired gang roar into a small California town, igniting street stunts, bar fights, and a tense standoff with local authorities. Shot in gritty black and white and scored to underscore its menace, the movie explored juvenile rebellion and pack mentality with unprecedented frankness. Upon its U.S. release in December 1953, critics noted its suspense, brutality, and sadism. But it was across the Atlantic where censorship truly struck. The British Board of Film Censors refused to grant any certificate, effectively banning the film from public exhibition from 1954 until 1967. BFC chairman Arthur Watkins and his successor argued that The Wild One glamorized violence and threatened to incite real-world rioting, a ban that only lifted when a new chairman finally deemed it less dangerous to youth. Though the ban was eventually overturned, The Wild One's notorious absence from British screens for 14 years cemented its reputation as one of the most incendiary films of the decade. No Orchids for Miss Blandish. No Orchids for Miss Blandish is a shockingly brutal British gangster picture, adapted from James Hadley Chase's notorious novel. Set in post-war New York, it follows heiress Dixie Farrell's botched kidnapping by hoodlums and her subsequent dark romance with her captor, Slim Grissom, whose obsessive love and gangster code spiral into torture and murder. The film's unflinching depictions of sexual coercion, sadistic violence, and moral depravity shattered the era's screen decorum. Outcry was immediate. In America, it met regional bans, and in Britain, several leading cinema chains refused to screen it. Critics branded it the worst film ever made, and the Monthly Film Bulletin slammed it as the most sickening exhibition of brutality, perversion, sex, and sadism ever to be shown on a cinema screen. A 1951 report notes multiple UK towns blacklisted the picture, even as it broke box office records where it played. Producers and censors alike recoiled, but No Orchids for Miss Blandish endured as a landmark of shock-driven exploitation, a portrait of greed and cruelty that forced audiences to confront cinema's darkest impulses. Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden takes viewers to a remote tropical island where an earnest anthropologist, Dr. David Sutton, leads a small documentary crew in search of a hidden Garden of Eden among lush jungles. What they discover instead is a secret nudist colony, its inhabitants living freely without clothes in sun-drenched glades and mountain springs. Those long, lingering shots of unadorned bodies, captured with soft-focus lenses and slow pans, were sold as a study of naturism's health benefits, but audiences flocked for the eroticism. Max Nosek's bare-bones direction and Ted Mellon's restless jazz score heighten every glance, turning what was pitched as anthropology into pure titillation. Censors reacted swiftly. In mid-1954, Pennsylvania's board ruled that any full frontal shot over 3 seconds was indecent and banned the film outright for lacking redeeming social value. Massachusetts and Maryland followed, and several southern locales invoked anti-obscenity statutes to block Garden of Eden entirely. Exhibitors rebranded it as the Forbidden Paradise and booked invitation-only screenings to evade local laws. In New York, state censors forced cuts to every extended nudist scene, yet underground bootleg copies circulated among grindhouse circuits. Across the Atlantic, British authorities refused classification until late 1956, while Ireland prescribed it until 1963. Exploitation king Kroger Babb's reissue, complete with lurid posters and a claim of first-ever all-body film event, only fueled its notoriety. Critics dismissed it as sleazy, but historians credit Garden of Eden with igniting debates on art versus obscenity, setting the stage for the battle over on-screen nudity that would roar through the 1960s. Nude on the Moon. Nude on the Moon blends low-budget sci-fi with all-female nudity in a story about a 21st-century lunar expedition. After crash landing, astronauts discover a civilization of lunarians, tall, ethereal women who worship the moon goddess Illumina and congregate in moonlit groves wearing nothing but metallic headbands. Director Doris Wishman uses crude sets and soft lighting to showcase the alien beauties, while a breathless narrator explains how lunar gravity created their exotic physiques. Eddie Kokoschka's jazz-inflected soundtrack underlines each reveal with spacey riffs. The film's flirtation with nude spectacle triggered censorship battles on both sides of the ocean. In the U.S., it was slapped with an X rating and banned outright in states like Pennsylvania and Kansas for graphic exposure. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned it as a perversion masquerading as science fiction, urging viewers to steer clear. In Britain, the BBFC refused classification in 1959, only permitting a heavily truncated version 2 years later after all extended nude sequences were excised. Australian censors demanded dark filters over any hint of frontal nudity before granting exhibition in 1962. Despite these bans, Nude on the Moon became a drive-in staple, marketed as outer space sex and alien intrigue, and drawing curious crowds. Though lampooned by mainstream critics, it endures as a cult artifact, one of the decade's most audacious attempts to push cinematic boundaries under the guise of interplanetary adventure. The Violent Years. The Violent Years. Ed Wood's 1956 cautionary tale of teenage rebellion centers on Paula Powers, a high school queen bee whose suburban charm masks her ruthless leadership of a juvenile crime ring. By day, Paula smiles for school portraits. By night, she orchestrates armed robberies, car thefts, and a chilling ambush that leaves an innocent store clerk fatally wounded. Wood's stark black and white cinematography, punctuated by sudden jump cuts, amplifies the shock of seeing adolescent girls behind masks of makeup and menace. Regional censors moved quickly. Pennsylvania's board demanded all scenes of firearm discharge be cut. When producers balked, the film was banned statewide. Ohio and New Jersey followed suit, labeling it harmful to teenage morals, concerned that impressionable youth would emulate Paula's leather jacket and carefree cruelty. The Catholic Legion of Decency slapped it with a condemned rating, declaring that it glorified antisocial behavior rather than teaching a moral lesson. Yet, ironically, these bans fueled the Violent Years' underground fame. Bootlegged prints circulated in late-night theater splices, and by the early 1960s, it found a new audience on late-night television airings. Scholars of juvenile delinquency cinema now cite it as a raw snapshot of post-war anxieties about teenage freedom, and as one of Ed Wood's most notorious provocations against 1950s respectability. The Delinquents. Robert Altman's debut feature, The Delinquents, chronicles a restless gang of Los Angeles teens led by Gary, who paddle through suburban streets in stolen cars, slash tires for kicks, and ultimately stage a convenience store robbery that spirals into violence. Altman's decision to cast unknowns, shoot on real streets, and allow improvised dialogue gives the film a documentary-style authenticity that unnerved censors. California's State Board of Review initially refused to certify it, demanding cuts to gunplay and profanity before any public showing. When the filmmakers refused, cities in the Deep South and Midwest denied permits for public exhibition, citing a statute against films that might incite lawlessness. In Britain, the BBFC banned The Delinquents in early 1958 as undesirable for all ages, keeping it off screens until 1961. Despite these obstacles, The Delinquents thrived in art houses and underground cinemas, buoyed by Martin Rubinstein's propulsive jazz score. Its unvarnished look at teenage frustration would foreshadow Altman's later career, and critics later hailed it as a chilling glimpse of teenage nihilism that paved the way for more honest portrayals of youth culture in the 1960s. Untamed Youth. Untamed Youth, released in late 1957 and directed by Norman Taurog, merges rock and roll rebellion with a dark tale of exploitation. Sisters Meg and Judy Richards inherit a rural Tennessee theater only to find it doubling as a brothel. Determined to expose local corruption, they enlist a gang of leather-clad bikers, sparking wild barroom brawls, high-speed chases, and a violent raid on the establishment's hidden back rooms. local censorship boards balked at the film's risque strip show imagery. Texas required every shoulder flash and thigh reveal trimmed, while Arkansas banned Untamed Youth outright under a law against immoral exhibitions. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned it, warning that its suggestive content threatened community standards, and several towns refused any outdoor advertising, forcing distributors to rely on hand-lettered marquee signs. Still, rock crowd audiences flocked to drive-ins, lured by appearances from the Platters in a rollicking musical interlude. Today, Untamed Youth is celebrated for its proto-grindhouse spirit, a cross-genre shocker that anticipated 1960s exploitation's blend of social critique, rock music, and pulp thrills, and stands as one of the most controversial films of the 1950s. Rebel Without a Cause. Released in October 1955, Rebel Without a Cause captures post-war teenage angst through Jim Stark, a sensitive newcomer to a suburban high school. Ostracized by peers and haunted by his parents' failures to understand him, Jim finds kinship with Judy and Plato, two similarly isolated youths. When a Chickie-run street race ends in violence, the trio goes into hiding, their emotional wounds laid bare in an abandoned mansion. Director Nicholas Ray's gritty portrayal of juvenile rebellion, underscored by Dean's legendary red jacket, resonated powerfully with young audiences and shocked adults who saw it as a dangerous celebration of defiance. Authorities in New Zealand banned the film outright in 1955, fearing it would incite teenage delinquency. In Britain, the BBFC imposed heavy cuts and refused certification until 1967, citing its glorification of violence and disrespect for authority. Spain prohibited the film until 1964, when foreign press pressure forced a belated release with an R18 rating. These bans only fueled the movie's mystique, cementing its status as both a cultural lightning rod and a defining document of youthful unrest in the 1950s. Kosh Boy. Kosh Boy, retitled The Slasher for American Audiences, explores juvenile delinquency in post-war Britain. The film follows Reg, a teddy boy who prowls the streets of London with a stolen Kosh, leading his gang into muggings and vandalism. Director Lewis Gilbert frames these young thugs as products of social neglect, capturing their swagger and desperation in sharp black and white cinematography. When Reg's violence escalates to a fatal stabbing, the community's fear crystallizes into moral panic, and the police intensify their crackdown. Censors in Sweden banned Kosh Boy outright in 1953, deeming its depiction of youth violence destructive to public morals. Birmingham authorities in England likewise refused local screenings, while Australian boards cited its glamorization of criminal behavior to deny entry. PTA groups and church leaders campaigned against the film, arguing that it lacked any redeeming moral lesson and risked inspiring copycat crime. Despite, or because of, these prohibitions, Kosh Boy became a touchstone in British crime cinema and a harbinger of the social realism movement that would follow. No Way Out. Directed by Joseph L. Mankiewicz, No Way Out confronts institutional racism through Dr. Luther Brooks, the first black physician in a segregated Los Angeles hospital. When his best friend is shot during a riot, Brooks faces violent backlash from white police officers and hospital staff, forcing him to navigate a perilous world of prejudice and terror. The film's unflinching portrayal of racial violence and slurs shattered Hollywood taboos, laying bare America's deep-seated inequities. Chicago police delayed its permit in August 1950 and briefly banned the film, fearing it would stoke racial unrest. The city eventually upped a ban recommendation before lifting it under mixed public pressure. Maryland, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Virginia showed only heavily censored versions, excising scenes of black patients preparing for self-defense. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned its offensive language and provocative scenes, while NAACP leaders lobbied for uncut exhibition to preserve the film's social message. Though controversy limited its initial reach, No Way Out earned Poitier an Oscar nomination and stands as a pioneering civil rights drama. High School Hellcats. American International Pictures. High School Hellcats follows Joyce Martin, a prim transfer student who must prove herself to the Hellcats, an all-girl gang enforcing loyalty through shoplifting, hazing, and defiance of school rules. Under Connie's leadership, Joyce navigates slacks bans, social exclusion, and the threat of expulsion, each test more dangerous than the last. Director Edward Burns frames the Hellcats' cruelty in jazz-tinged sequences and claustrophobic settings, underscoring the era's fear of female autonomy and youth rebellion. When PTA groups in Los Angeles learned of its scenes depicting underage drinking, shoplifting, and immoral behavior, they successfully pressured local boards to ban the film outright, citing its lack of moral compensation and its potential to corrupt teenage girls. Despite, or because of, these condemnations, high school Hellcats became a staple of late-night grindhouse revivals, remembered as a proto-Mean Girls saga and a snapshot of 1950s anxieties about teenage freedom and gender roles. Blackboard Jungle. Richard Brooks's Blackboard Jungle revolutionized teen cinema by pairing Glenn Ford's idealistic teacher, Richard Daddier, with Bill Haley and his Comets rock and roll anthem, Rock Around the Clock. Set in a racially mixed inner-city high school, Daddier confronts switchblade-wielding Artie West and his peers, capturing their raw hostility and eventual transformation through education and empathy. The film's candid violence, fistfights, racial epithets, and a real drum solo shattered the decorum of classroom melodramas. Authorities in Memphis banned Blackboard Jungle in March 1955, claiming its depiction of juvenile delinquency threatened public order. Atlanta's review board labeled it immoral, obscene, and licentious, while the BBFC in Britain refused classification until 1967, insisting on cuts to fight scenes and racial tension. Australia initially barred it entirely before reversing the ban with 165 feet excised. These controversies ignited midnight cinema riots, teens tearing seats and dancing in aisles, cementing the film's reputation as the flashpoint of youth culture and rock and roll rebellion. Glenn or Glenda. Directed by Ed Wood, Glenn or Glenda is a low-budget psychological drama that blurs the lines between fact and exploitation. The film follows Glenn, a troubled young man torn between societal expectations and his obsession with women's clothing. Scenes of cross-dressing, gender dysphoria, and a staged transsexual operation use surreal imagery and stilted narration to shock mid-century audiences. Wood's production values, ragged editing, stark sets, and unnerving close-ups heighten the sense of otherness and moral panic that fuel the story. Upon submission to the British Board of Film Censors in February 1958, it was rejected as unsuitable for certification, effectively banning it in the United Kingdom until finally granting a certificate in January 1995. Critics and local boards in the United States likewise balked at depictions of cross-dressing and implied sexual deviance, with at least one state demanding cuts to scenes of men wearing women's lingerie. Though not overtly violent, the film's exploitation of taboo identity and psychologically charged imagery pushed 1950s censorship boundaries. Today, Glenn or Glenda stands as a landmark in outsider cinema, an unsettling glimpse into Ed Wood's obsession with gender, and a harsh, brutal indictment of 1950s censorship rules. Vinti, directed by Gillo Pontecorvo in 1954, presents a trilogy of real-life-inspired vignettes that chronicle the descent of European youth into crime. Shot in a stark, semi-documentary style, the film opens in Paris with teenage pickpockets exploiting tourists, follows an English scholarship student driven to suicide by blackmail, and closes in Naples where impoverished children are sold into petty prostitution. Pontecorvo's raw, unflinching portrayal of adolescent brutality, exposed through unfiltered street violence, sexual exploitation, and self-mutilation, shocked audiences accustomed to more sanitized post-war cinema. When submitted to the British Board of Film Censors in May 1954, Vinti was refused any certificate due to its graphic depiction of juvenile crime and lack of moral compensation, effectively banning it in the United Kingdom with no later appeal. The film's violent imagery, including a graphic suicide by drowning and a scene implying child prostitution negotiations, pushed 1950s censorship boundaries beyond recognition. Today, critics acknowledge Vinti as an important precursor to the Mondo genre, a brutal and uncompromising exposé of youth disillusionment whose censorship history underscores mid-century anxieties about social decay and cinematic realism, and it resonates today as a stark social warning. The Immoral Mr. Tease, Russ Meyer's The Immoral Mr. Tease, released in 1959, pioneered the nudie-cutie subgenre by combining a loose narrative with extensive female nudity. Bill Tease, a mild-mannered door-to-door salesman, undergoes a dental procedure that gives him X-ray vision, allowing him to see every woman he meets entirely nude. Meyer shoots in colorful vignettes, sexually suggestive imagery, slimline protagonists, and surreal dental room fantasies that exploit mid-century audiences' fascination with taboo desires. His abrupt jump cuts from mundane exteriors to ravenously naked bodies created a jarring contrast, intensifying the film's shock value and subverting production code limits. Although the film avoided explicit sex, its frank portrayal of female breasts and voyeuristic camera angles alarmed censors. In November 1962, Maryland's State Board of Censors banned The Immoral Mr. Tease for 12 months in Baltimore, declaring its sexually explicit content obscene and harmful to moral standards. Similar reactions followed in other states and local jurisdictions, where exhibitors withdrew prints or submitted to strict cuts. The censor battles propelled Meyer's career and cemented his reputation as a provocateur. Today, The Immoral Mr. Tease is recognized as a landmark of sexploitation cinema, whose censorship history reflects America's turbulent journey toward on-screen sexual freedom. It remains a cult favorite among exploitation aficionados. Girlstown. Directed by Charles F. Haas and released in 1959, Girlstown trades on rock and roll, teenage rebellion, and lurid sexual undercurrents. Mamie Van Doren stars as Silver Morgan, a peroxide blonde delinquent wrongfully accused of her sister's accidental death. Shuttled to a reform school run by strict nuns, Silver clashes in violent catfights, bar brawls, and conspiracies before leading a daring rescue of her real sister from predatory gangs. Musical interludes by Paul Anka and the Platters heighten the tension between innocence and corruption. Despite its framing as a cautionary tale, Girlstown flaunted sensual shower sequences and an attempted rape that outraged censors. When the film premiered in Italy in June 1960, the Committee for the Theatrical Review ordered the removal of any continuous full-frontal shower shots, deeming them offensive to decency, and banning the uncut version. Several American cities also demanded cuts to underage drinking and gang violence scenes, while drive-in promoters advertised sex, music, and mayhem to sidestep local censorship laws. Today, Girlstown is recognized for its proto-grindhouse spirit and as a snapshot of 1950s exploitation, highlighting how sensationalist imagery clashed with moral gatekeepers in the fight over youth culture on screen. Portland Exposé. Portland Exposé is a hard-hitting B-movie noir directed by Harold D. Schuster, released in August 1957. Based on a real McClellan Committee investigation into corruption, it follows tavern owner George Madison as he becomes entangled with violent mobsters running pinball machine rackets. The film spares no graphic detail. Close-up shots of beatings, acid threats, and gun violence expose the underbelly of small-town corruption and fear. Allied artists distributed the picture widely, but local authorities in the Pacific Northwest balked. Approximately 20 cities withdrew it from theaters, and the planned Portland premiere was canceled after real-world figures threatened lawsuits. The result? Portland Exposé was banned within a 30-mile radius of its namesake city, a rare instance where legal intimidation shuttered a release. Critics of the day dubbed its depiction of organized crime and moral decay too raw for mainstream audiences. Despite censorship, Portland Exposé found audiences in grindhouse circuits and late-night screenings, where its unvarnished portrayal of vice earned it cult status. Today it is hailed as a pioneering example of crime exploitation cinema, its ban illustrating the fierce battle between cinematic realism and community gatekeepers in the 1950s. These 20 banned exploitation films remind us that art often thrives on controversy and the urge to confront uncomfortable truths. If you enjoyed this deep dive into forbidden film lore, hit subscribe and share your favorite shocking movie moment in the comments below.